When we think of Russia, usually the first things that spring to mind are Moscow, St. Petersburg, the Orthodox Church, and Slavic features. However, this is not the only face of Russia. The Buryats, Yakuts, Chechens, Tuvas, Avars, and many others are also citizens of the Russian Federation. Today we're describing what lies beyond the western part of Russia, about the Buryats and Yakuts and the other ethnic groups in Russia. Why are they Russians? How do the millions of non-ethnic Russians in the Federation feel about the war in Ukraine? Do they understand it and support it? How is the Kremlin combating the individuality of the different ethnic groups, and could those groups cause Russia to collapse? According to official figures, ethnic Russians make up approximately 80% of the citizens of the Russian Federation. Some claim this number is inflated, but even if we accept it, it means that there are 28 million people in Russia who have a different ethnicity. That's more than the populations of the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Austria combined. Russia owes its large territory to centuries of conquest. They began in the 16th century with the conquest of the Khanate of Kazan. Over the next years, Russia continued its eastward expansion. This partly overlapped with the age of colonialism.
Mam wrażenie, że jak myślimy o imperiach kolonialnych, to najczęściej...
When we think about colonial empires, I have the impression that most of the time we forget about Russia. There's the British Empire, the French Empire, the Belgian Empire, and a few others, but no Russia. In the standard stereotypical Western conviction, Russia was not a colonial empire, but the truth is completely different. The Russian and later Soviet Empire was a very similar colonial empire to those classical Western European colonial empires. The only difference is that you needed to sail from London to Britain's colonies, and from Moscow or Petersburg you could just go overland.
A z Moskwy czy z Petersburga wystarczyło dostać się drogą lądową.
Russia kept its colonies and they are part of the Russian state. Even now, in many territories, ethnic Russians are not the majority.
Tatarstan na przykład, który jest wprawdzie w ramach państwa rosyjskiego od
For example, Tatarstan. It's been part of the Russian state for nearly 500 years. But in Tatarstan, Tatars are in the majority. Tuva, where Russia's current Minister of Defense is from, is dominated by Tuvans, not ethnic Russians. 30 years ago, there was a pogrom of ethnic Russians there. We're talking about when the Soviet Union collapsed. Some of the ethnic Russian population had to escape from Tuva. Tuva is a small Russian republic at the Mongolian and Chinese border, and its people have their own state history. It was only in 1940 that the Soviet Union annexed Tuva. Even further east is Bashkiria, where there is a significant proportion of Bashkirs. And in the north are Yakuts. In Yakutia, they are the majority, not ethnic Russians. Moreover, the demographic trends in these republics show that Yakuts or other non-ethnic Russian minorities are growing. Ethnic Russians are leaving or simply having fewer children. There's one very unusual region in the Russian Federation, the North Caucasus, where the number of ethnic Russians is constantly falling. Over the last 30 years, they have decreased rather than increased in number. So the ethnic situation of the Russian Federation is more complicated than it often appears. Russian policy on ethnic minorities has two aspects. There is the official aspect and the real one. Officially, Russia protects the rights of ethnic minorities. It supports their cultural and linguistic development. Everything looks good in the Russian constitution and various government documents. However, not over the last 30 years, but much longer, in the Soviet Union and Tsarist Empire, there has been a progressing Russification, a denationalization above all of the smaller nations. The Russian Empire, first the Tsarist one and then the Bolshevik one and today the Putinist one, aimed at unifying the state, so that the Russian language dominated. so that a Russian consciousness and identity dominated, so that the smaller, non-ethnic Russian peoples would gradually take on a Russian identity. An example of these two aspects which the Russian state employs towards minorities can be found in education. Theoretically, in republics with a non-ethnic Russian identity, two languages are used, Russian and the local language. And theoretically, students and their parents can choose which language will be used in the classroom.
Również z uwagi na to, że na przykład egzaminy
The school leaving exams, the United States exam or YEGA, are taken in Russian, and subjects other than language are taught in Russian. This means that more often even, members of these minorities choose Russian as the general language of instruction. They don't want to waste time studying in a language which harms their job prospects. This legislation does not impose anything. It does not remove the right to study the language. But in practice, it's constructed so that ethnic Russians do not have to study other languages, and non-ethnic Russian groups are also more likely to choose Russian, because that language will be more useful for them. Also, at the level of various institutions, anyone thinking of a career in government needs to remember that above all, Russian is the language in force. If they want to have a career in these institutions, they will have to learn Russian and invest their time in that language. Another issue is what activists from non-ethnic Russian communities think. It's also about the process of studying itself, the systemic approach to learning. Studying in the national minority languages is not as well prepared as studying in Russian. There are no textbooks or methodology. This is also an area which the state has taken on. However, part of these obligations are handed down to the regions, which are supposed to invest in them themselves. But due to financial problems and limited budgets, it's often an underfunded industry. And all this leads to study in these national languages being limited in practice.
Problems in relations between minorities and the capital were laid bare and accelerated by the war in Ukraine. Non-ethnic Russians are the first to be sent to war. Based on publicly available data, journalists from the BBC and Medusa compiled the names of Russians who have died in Ukraine and grouped them according to ethnicity. The analysis revealed the overrepresentation of non-ethnic Russian groups among those who have died at the front lines. For example, there were 5 times as many Buryats as would be expected by their proportion in society as a whole. These data caused outrage among members of these minorities. They accused the Kremlin of intentional denationalization. However, there are many reasons to believe that the overrepresentation of ethnic minorities fighting in Ukraine is caused by poverty.
The
national republics, with a large number of non-ethnic Russians, are the poor republics. They struggle with various economic and social problems. They are poorly invested in, and above all, this means that men and boys from these regions are drawn to the army, first as contract soldiers, and then during mobilization, which, as we know, can be well paid. And the state propaganda, when it wanted to encourage young men, or any men to mobilize, stressed that it's a great way to earn money. In republics such as Buryatia and the North Caucasus republics, this is significant because there is no other way to earn money there. The doors to social advancement are closed in those republics. These are poor regions with bad infrastructure. The majority of people live in villages where, apart from simple jobs, there is no other way to advance. And so the offer from the state to take part in mobilization is appealing for some residents, and the state propaganda also emphasizes this. On the other hand, if we look at the demographics of these regions, then often the non-ethnic Russian regions have better numbers, because the non-ethnic Russian communities have a different kind of ties. Kin ties are closer, and horizontal ties are stronger. There's greater pressure on the family to help people cope. So the demographics are better, and there are more men available who can potentially be interested in going to war. In the case of Buryatia, it's a region bordering Mongolia, so it's quite strongly militarized. Military units were always there. At the beginning of the war, mainly contract soldiers were recruited there. Earlier on, the capital of Buryatia, Ulan-Ude, was a closed city because the arms industry was developed there, mainly aviation factories producing helicopters.
Rumors of the Kremlin intentionally sending non-ethnic Russians to fight in the war caused great resistance from organizations linked to minorities.
It can be said that this is linked to the risk that these smaller ethnic minorities will simply cease to exist in Russia. If a large number of men go to the front and die, then first of all, households will have trouble functioning. Life in Siberia is very tough, especially in the winter. Fuel needs to be prepared to preserve one's family. So if there are no men, these everyday problems will appear. And in the long term, it affects demographics, because if a large number of young men go to the front and perish, and we know that they are dying en masse, then after some time there will be a demographic collapse in those regions. And in the long term, it raises the question as to whether these nations can survive. And above all, this approach to the war is one element of bad relations between the non-ethnic Russian minorities and the capital. In the non-ethnic Russian regions, there is a feeling that the center, meaning Moscow, the federal center, the Kremlin, that it is exploiting the whole country, that it's following a colonial policy based on exploiting the natural resources of those regions, which are highly varied, rich in nature and natural resources, such as fuel sources, coal, and metals. Voices can be heard there that Moscow is preying on these regions, and that regions themselves have no agency. They can't even decide on the kind of elite that rules over them, because the governors are nominated by the Kremlin.
When the mobilization started in Russia, footage from the protests was seen worldwide. Most of the time, these protests took place in ethnic minority republics. For example, in Buryatia, Tuva, Yakutia, and Dagestan.
People there were ready to protest to defend their family members. It's mostly women who were present at these protests. This also shows that kin bonds are stronger there and that relatives are prepared to take risks. However, if we look at the Russian media space, there were also some kinds of protests and appeals regarding participation in the war and the mobilization. These, however, concerned material issues. They weren't critical of the war. They, above all, concerned the conditions of the mobilization. For example, relatives of Buryat soldiers, or the soldiers themselves from the front. They recorded a video addressed to the regional government, to the governor, or even to the central government level, meaning to Vladimir Putin. They asked him to check or improve the conditions of the mobilization, or to send them some warm clothes, and so on. On the one hand, this is interesting because it's not an anti-war protest as such, but it is about participating in the war. On the other hand, these people are aware that any kind of anti-state or anti-war protest would immediately be pacified by the government. The soldier's family would suffer repression, as would soldiers themselves. So, to avoid this, knowing what format of action is allowed, that's how I would explain these protests.
No great ideological involvement in the war can be seen either, nor can we see any patriotic fervor.
These are groups that, above all, focus on survival. If they do become involved in the war, then it's so that they can survive and to earn money. They approach it pragmatically, because they can't see another career path for themselves, other means of supporting themselves. There is no patriotic conviction or any drive that it's a war to defend Russia or a war against fascism. This is also very important in the context of the history of these regions, because they suffered a great deal at the hands of Russia. There is a trend now that the local, regional history is re-emerging, and identity at the ethnic and local level is becoming more important.
In many ways, the non-ethnic Russian nations in the Russian Federation differ greatly from ethnic Russians. The Buryats are a good example of this. This nation is mostly settled within the autonomous Republic of Buryatia. It is a Mongolic nation with a Mongolic language. The Buryats also have a different religion to ethnic Russians. The majority are Buddhists.
Na terenie tej republiki są świątynie buddyjskie i kilka takich ośrodków
The area has Buddhist temples and a few well-known Buddhist centers, including Iwolinski Datsan, which is famous for its architecture and Buddhist monastery. It's a place of worship visited by many tourists. However, when we talk about the local color of this region, Buddhism is visible. In many places in Buryatia, there are places of worship, or places where worshippers leave votive ribbons or coins, which are linked to their religion. This lends this republic a unique character.
The capital of Buryatia is Ulan-Ude. The city is famous for holding the world record for the largest head of Lenin.
The whole monument is well over 10 meters tall, and the head is around 7-8 meters tall. It's in the city center, and various events are held there. In connection with the so-called special military operation in Ukraine, it has been adorned with the letter Z. Some people say that Lenin, in this monument, was intentionally given Asian facial features, just in case they need to modify him into a different monument if there was a change in the political situation.
Buryatia has been part of the Russian state since the turn of the 17th and 18th century, but the local identity is still strong there.
The region definitely has a very strong national identity. It's based on local ethnic backgrounds, rooted in their religion, which is Buddhism. This makes the foundation of this identity very strong and really different from that of ethnic Russians. There really is a sense of difference in these regions, and there is a hostility towards the capital, towards the federal center in Moscow. It's caused by a perception that the politics of the center feeds on the regions, depriving them of the precious resources that they are entitled to. Access to land is also being limited. Traditionally, these nations survived by hunter-gathering and fishing. Various legal regulations and restrictions changed this and restricted access to land. This is also an issue brought up by these communities.
The sensations these nations have of being different was visible during the collapse of the USSR.
Kiedy osłabienie władzy centralnej, rozpad Związku Sowieckiego, on też
The weakening and fall of the Soviet Union caused an increase in the power of national movements in certain parts of the Russian Federation. Not only in republics like Tatarstan, Bashkiria or Buryatia, but also in smaller ones like Tuva, Yakutia and, of course, the North Caucasus, starting with the Chechen War. We're talking about a situation from nearly 30 years ago, when in many later federal subjects of Russia there were visible tendencies towards autonomy. Some republics began passing resolutions on sovereignty, introducing their own constitutions and laws, stating that the Bashkir or Tatar constitution had precedence over the constitution of the Russian Federation. It was a moment when regional elites began to understand that with a weak Moscow, this was their moment to get all the independence they can carry, to paraphrase Boris Yeltsin in 1990. It was a time when, although the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a question of whether the Russian Federation would also unravel to some extent. This was an open question. As we know, there was a war in the North Caucasus. Chechnya for a long time did not recognize the authority of Moscow and declared itself an independent sovereign state. Only after sending Russian soldiers and clamping down on the Chechen rebellion did Chechnya return to the Russian Federation's jurisdiction. Although there were no wars as such in other republics, there were at least tendencies towards autonomy. It showed that after 70 years of the Soviet Union, although the Moscow Center believed that the entire Soviet territory was unified and Russified and that there are no separatist tendencies, but the truth was much more complicated. This was a real surprise for the West, which had a very stereotypical perception both of the Soviets and later of Russia, as a state with a dominating Russian ethnicity. It turned out that nations in republics further away from Moscow did, in fact, exist, and they showed it to Moscow and the world. The scenario of a collapse of the Russian Federation is often referenced as a deterrent in propaganda. Vladimir Putin himself mentioned this not so long ago.
Russian society is afraid of a collapse. It's something that the Kremlin has always scared its citizens with. That we don't know what might happen then, and that there will be chaos. Nuclear arms might fall into the wrong hands. This is what Russians are afraid of and would like to avoid. For the same reason, both Russian society and the liberal Russian opposition, the one which is now mostly outside the country, distances itself from those oppositionists and formations who would want to use arms to fight for the independence of some Russian regions or rebel against the Kremlin. This is somewhat a taboo. There is no readiness for this either in the Russian society or among the opposition.
The question remains whether it is a realistic scenario that the Russian Federation could collapse into smaller ethnic republics.
W moim przekonaniu teraz obecnie jakby tego potencjału nie ma.
In my opinion, at the moment, the potential for this is not there. There is, however, the great unknown as to what will happen after the war in Ukraine. Therefore, the scenario of a collapse is treated as something that might happen. At the moment, there are no symptoms that something on the regional level might happen. No rebellions or military uprisings. Quite the contrary, most people who are active in the region or dissatisfied with state politics or the war are leaving Russia. Speaking about Buryatia, there is a significant outflow of people ethnically Buryats who are leaving towards Kazakhstan or Mongolia. Active people are leaving the country, and on the regional level, there is no sign of an armed struggle for independence or secession from Russia. The main issue lies in the nature of the relationship between the federal center and the regions, as there is significant control over the elites and the regional budget, because it's the center that decides the budget.
Wojna na Ukrainie może być takim nowym impulsem do
The war in Ukraine may be a new impulse to a variety of growing independence ambitions in certain parts of the Russian Federation, but with one main condition, that Russia loses the war, and it's such a painful loss for the Kremlin elite that certain nations which form the Russian Federation receive the signal that the center in Moscow has problems, and that this is our chance to make use of these problems. This doesn't mean that the Russian Federation will definitely collapse, though. I think that this Russian defeat would need to be a series of losses, acute, symbolic, and reputational ones. Although it's not the most probable scenario now, it cannot be ruled out. A question remains regarding the quality of the various non-Russian elites in certain republics of the Russian Federation, and also how far-reaching the destabilization inside Russia may be after, potentially, and hopefully, Russia loses the war in Ukraine.
Może być destabilizacja sytuacji wewnątrzrosyjskiej po potencjalnie, i miejmy nadzieję, przegranej Rosji w wojnie na Ukrainie.
Thank you for watching this video. For more OSW documentaries and interviews, please subscribe to our channel.